Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for joining on this live stream. I'm joined with Dr. Jonathan McLatchie and maybe a couple of other surprises here. And so anyways, today we're talking about a recent video made by Paulogia. A lot of you guys leave comments about Paulogia and his videos. You want me to respond to those videos. Well, this is going to definitely be that. Paulogia recently made a video about 5 days ago. I think it was titled Christian Scholar Exposes Minimal Facts. And as you guys know, I'm a pretty big McGrew, and he is responding to Lydia's criticisms of the minimal facts argument, which you guys know that I'm also kind of a big critic of. But then he also goes on to try to criticize maximal data. And does he succeed? Well, we'll find out here as we go. We'll be watching the video, and so without further ado, I have a couple of special guests that I'd like to add here. And so this worked out at the last minute, and I'm super, super excited. Lydia and Tim, thank you so much for joining kind of just last minute. And I think who better to discuss this than you guys? And so, but yeah, I'm just going to be a fly on the wall mostly. I might have a couple things to say, but I'm really going to defer to you guys. And I know, Jonathan, he mentions a lot of articles later in the video. We'll get to that, but that you have responded to. So I'm really looking forward to picking your guys' brains. So before we jump in, I will give Paulogia some credit. I think the parts that he highlighted with your appearance on Capturing Christianity, Lydia, I thought were really well put together. I think he really highlighted the issues with the minimal facts argument, and I'm appreciative that he's at least bringing this to the discussion, because so many people think that the argument for the resurrection just is minimal facts or like Dr. Craig's approach, and there's a much better option, I believe, out there that needs to be discussed more. And so before we jump into Paulogia's videos, do you get Paulogia's video where he critiques max data? Do you guys have any comments or anything before we bring Paulogia on the screen here?
Go for it.
All right, let's do it. So here we go. Just tell me when to stop, and I will let you guys make commentary.
Lydia doesn't merely bash minimal facts strategists. She has a method she advocates for that she calls maximal data.
So here's my approximately 1-minute version. The disciples claimed, as we find in the Gospels, that they had lengthy conversations with Jesus after he had died, that they had the ability to touch him, that he ate with them on more than one occasion, that he stayed with them for several weeks. All of these things that are found in the Gospels.
As Lydia's single source is the Bible, she has likely anticipated a "for the Bible tells me so" response. This doesn't mean I've misunderstood her nuanced claim that the Gospels are independent.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, she says that her single source is the Bible. The Bible is not a single source. The New Testament is made up of 27 different books. Right. So you can't just treat the Bible as a single source.
It actually matters. What Jonathan is pointing out matters because part of the argument, or part of several of the arguments, is the way that different sources in places where they are clearly not dependent on one another intersect. And that is just something that you can't get in that way out of a single source. I'm not saying there's nothing interesting to be said for a single source, but if he's getting that bit wrong, then he's going to miss, inevitably, the structure of those arguments.
Well, I think that's especially important because of the claim that this is circular or that this is religious in some way. If you're treating the Gospels as at least alleged historical sources, then you have to treat them as separate. It's only if you're treating them as somehow a single religious thing that we just somehow venerate or something because it's our holy book, that then you end up thinking of it as a single source. And it's interesting that Paulogia here, he's kind of talking about the Bible the way that certain fundamentalist Christians would talk about the Bible, that it's all this one thing that we must either respect or disrespect. You respect it if you're a Christian, you disrespect it if you're a non-Christian, and that's it as a matter of faith. Whereas I'm saying let's approach them as alleged historical sources, but then automatically there's 4 of them, and 5 if you count Acts.
Right. All right. Well, not off to a great start here, but we'll let him say a little bit more.
Sources, but rather that I have considered and rejected this claim. The stands.
Okay, so real quick, he's flashing up a picture of like the synoptic problem. Like it's a graphic that's highlighting the different relationship, literary dependence to the 4 Gospels. And I think this is one of the things that Paulogia, and I run into a lot of skeptics who are like, well, something like Undesigned Coincidences, well, that doesn't even work because haven't you heard about the synoptic problem? Lydia, I mean, come on. Haven't you ever heard of that, Mark came first and John, Luke and Matthew copied? And I mean, can you just real briefly just touch on that for a second?
Yeah, and he's not gonna mention the synoptic problem explicitly later, but like you say, it's represented in the graphic. But he is going to talk about dependence because he's going to be quoting Bart Ehrman later on alleged dependence. Yes, I've heard of the synoptic problem. I have a video called "What I Think of the Synoptic Problem," and the fact is that we don't have to treat the 3 synoptic gospels, which is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as being either wholly dependent or wholly independent. Like that's a false dilemma. So they can be making some use of each other as sources, either for language or for events, but then also have supplementary information. And I believe that the evidence we have actually supports that partial independence and partial dependence. We have to actually look at the stories and look at the wording to see whether we appear to have dependence or independence and how much of each. But that's why the notion of some synoptic dependence does not just cashier undesigned coincidences, even among the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Of course, many of them are involving John, who isn't even a synoptic gospel anyway. So I think that would be a brief address to it, and then we'll get into it more later when he starts quoting Bart Ehrman and talking about dependence.
Okay.
This is what the original people in a position to know, claimed.
Like all the scholars she was referencing earlier, I reject this notion. I do not think that the Gospels reflect what original people in a position to know claimed. I doubt we would even agree on who such people are.
There are 3 possible explanations of their claiming this.
I'm not interested in the explanations for a claim I don't accept, but okay.
One is that they were deceivers, they were lying. Another is that they were mistaken. And a third is that they were telling the truth.
Or a combination.
The context of their making these claims, which we find attested, for example, in the early chapters of Acts.
Single source.
Shows that they knew they were risking their lives for doing this. And that really rules out that they were lying.
Even granting Acts, I'm hard-pressed to see evidence that more than 1 or 2 of the original disciples were...
Stop. So
yeah, I had a feeling, Jonathan, you'd want to jump in there. Go ahead.
So he says that as to the early persecution of Christians, we only have a single source, namely Acts. So that's what I understand him to be saying. But that's just completely false. I mean, we have the letters of Paul. We have Clement of Rome in section 5 or chapter 5 of Clement of Rome's epistle to the church in Corinth. We have Tacitus attests to the persecution of early Christians. He's a Roman source in the early 2nd century, and so forth. So it's not simply the case that we have a single source for early Christian persecution. We have a lot of evidence for early Christian persecution, and actually, as Lydia has adduced in her books, especially in Hidden in Plain View, there are examples even of undesigned coincidences that corroborate early Christian persecution, especially the persecution of the Apostle Paul. So this, I think, I think Paulogia is completely out to lunch on this particular point.
I'm finally going to. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, just to add to what Jonathan said, consider also, say, the Petron Epistles. And for this purpose, it does not matter whether you think that they were written by Peter or by someone else. They were written early enough that we have to take what is said there as being intelligible to first century Christians. And there are numerous references to perseverance under persecution, to enduring. What if these things even mean if there was no such context? They wouldn't even be intelligible.
So I'm going to finally say something about the "For the Bible Tells Me So" jingle. We've all been sort of waiting for an opportunity to do that. So I just think that's really inappropriate here, because we ought to be allowed the possibility of treating biblical books as at least potential historical sources without being ridiculed as just kind of having faith and bringing in "For the Bible tells me so." And it's like, okay, so what that seems to be saying is that the only way to defend yourself against the claim that you're just saying "For the Bible tells me so" is if you have so much disdain and just complete disrespect for the biblical books. Like, no way, they're not historical sources. I'm not going to bring them up. I'm not going to treat them seriously as historical sources, even if I think I have evidence that they're good historical sources. Which I do. If you don't take that completely dismissive attitude toward them, you are then going to get a "For the Bible tells me so" jingle, because you, God forbid, cited, or whoever forbid, cited the book of Acts as a historical source for something that was going on in first century Palestine. And that's absurd. I would presume that if you say, believe this, "For the Bible tells me so," that's supposed to refer to some kind of leap of faith, some kind of evidence-free, because it's from, Jesus loves me, right? How do I know? "For the Bible tells me so." Here I am writing 3 books, investigating, concluding that the Gospels are good historical sources. I understand that Paulogia disagrees with me, but disagreeing with me and characterizing me as just citing this because the Bible tells me so are not the same thing. He could disagree with me while still recognizing that I'm not just saying this because the Bible tells me so, but because I've concluded that these books, which happen to be collected into this collection we call the Bible, are good historical sources. So I just wanted to, I know we've all been talking about this past week, like, oh geez, that jingle, so I just thought I would get that right out there at the beginning here.
Right. So I have just a follow-up observation on that. It seems quite obvious that he hasn't read any of Lydia's books. Fair enough, right? Life is short, and the books, 2 of them at least, are quite long. And so he can't be bothered to dig into that. But even the public content that's out there on Facebook, on Lydia's author page, on her blog page, there is the YouTube channel. There's plenty of material that would have shown that this is not a fair representation. So either he, which I suspect is the truth, he didn't take the time to look at it, or he did and he's lying.
No,
I think it's just that he didn't even bother to look at it, perhaps because it has never occurred to him that someone could disagree with him for reasons. And it's just not a good look to be assuming that people can't have reasons for disagreeing with you. I mean, I think Bart Ehrman has reasons for disagreeing with me. I disagree with his reasons, but we can talk about them. We can engage with them. There's no engagement here.
Well, he tried to defend himself against that. He said, "I have not misunderstood her nuanced argument, but I'm just not convinced by it." So it's this weird idea that if he's not convinced by my argument that the Gospels are good historical sources, he gets to throw up a jingle that characterizes me as using these just "For the Bible tells me so." So that's why I said it the way I did, that basically, if you draw a different conclusion from his about the reliability of books of the Bible, however much work you put into it, however many reasons you put into it, and then you end up using them as if they're historical sources, I guess you automatically, because you came to the wrong conclusion, rate a "For the Bible Tells Me So" jingle.
Can two play at this game?
Make a lot of sense. Pardon?
Yeah, I mean, can I put up cartoons showing him saying, "I just don't like God," and
right,
say, "Well,
it would be about like that." Yeah.
I mean, this is juvenile. Let's graduate. Let's move on to actually trying to engage in some ways with people's arguments. Ostensibly, this is the part of the video where he is going to examine your maximal data approach, and it's sounding like
start. It's not starting.
This is sounding like a version of the Monty Python argument clinic.
Argument clinic. That's one of my favorite sketches. And so, yeah, well, we'll see a little bit more as he unpacks it. I want to make sure that, because I know Paul a little bit, and we've had a discussion before, and I'm familiar with some of his videos. And so I think he'd probably say it a little more nuanced than that, but for the sake of time, we'll let him unpack it, and then I might jump in a little bit more with that. So,
route preaching. And history doesn't support this early persecution narrative, as Dr. Bart Ehrman tried to explain to Lydia's husband.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, as
Bart... he's going to play it. Let him play it.
Let him play through Bart bluffing his way through this. Go.
Tim.
5,000 people are joined to the church, and there's no opposition until chapter 4, when 2 of these people, Peter and John, are opposed. So we have 8,000 converts, and we have 2 people thrown in prison. Now, are we supposed to imagine that these 8,000 people who have just converted to believe in Jesus are not telling anybody about the stories they've heard? Are they not telling their spouses and their children and their slaves and their next door neighbors? Are there Romans on every corner or Jewish authorities on every corner and in every household saying, no, you can't tell the story of Jesus to all of these 8,000 people? I think that's absolutely incredible. People are telling stories and they're not being threatened with imprisonment. There are only 2 people who are imprisoned in the very story that you're talking about.
All right, let's just cut that and let's talk. You have to, I've said this before, but you really have to appreciate the dexterity with which Bart Ehrman can force a card. There's almost no one I can think of who is better than he at substituting something you weren't saying for something you were and pretending like he is recapitulating your actual position and refuting it. He's slick with that, and he sounds so reasonable until you engage your brain and say, wait, hold it. Was that what was really at issue here? So let's break this down in a couple of different ways. Number 1, who would you go after if you were trying to stop a new religious cult that you thought was very pernicious? People on the street who might have been attracted to it, or people who were out there as leaders? Obvious. You would go for the leaders. Point number 2, if you were talking about people who had been imprisoned and you were writing the story of the origin of the Christian movement, who would you write about? The leaders or average Joe on the street? Of course, you're going to write about the leaders. Point number 3, to say that there were 2 people imprisoned and another person beheaded and another person stoned is not to say that there were no other people. It's to talk about them. To say, yes, but it mentions only them is not the same thing as to say it says that they were the only ones who faced any kind of resistance. So this is all kinds of silly right at the get-go. And I'm just getting started, but I think there's more to say.
It explicitly, if I recall correctly, when we get into Saul of Tarsus, it says that he's dragging people off to prison. It doesn't name them, but it does that he's hailing many of them and taking them to prison. So I mean, it even says that more people were imprisoned. So
right, but Bart's going to focus on the first 4 chapters of Acts, and he said, "I only said in the first 4." Okay, but we're within a few months of this, and these are the things that are going on, right? And Saul's got letters from the Jewish authorities licensing him to go up into Damascus and do the same thing. So yeah, no, this
Furthermore, the argument from martyrdom that we would put forward, I think, is somewhat more nuanced than the sort of argument that sometimes put forward in other apologetic circles. We're not our argument is not wedded to or committed to individual apostles necessarily going all the way to martyrdom. I think that the evidence for apostolic martyrdom, for the most part, is flimsy. We do have evidence for some of the apostles being martyred, in particular Peter, the apostle Paul, James, the son of Zebedee, James, the brother of Jesus. But besides those, we don't really have a lot of evidence that for apostolic martyrdom. However, what is more important to the argument is the broader context of persecution against the early Christian movement. And so those who were leaders in the early Christian movement, such as Peter and the other apostles, those who were purportedly eyewitnesses, represented themselves as eyewitnesses to Jesus' resurrection. These individuals are proclaiming the message of the gospel, including the resurrection, in a context where they are going against their own self-interests. They're going against their own interests in regards to self-preservation. And when life or liberty are at stake, as appears to have been the case in the early Christian movement, multi-party conspiracies have a tendency to break down. And so we're not necessarily saying that this is that the early apostolic persecution proves sincerity, but we are saying that it does go a long way towards establishing that they are sincere in what they are asserting to have been witnesses to.
They're risking. It's what they're risking and knowingly risking in a very volatile situation. I mean, for Bart to say, "Oh, only 2 people get thrown in jail," he makes it sound as though there wasn't much zeal for persecuting them. But there really was. I mean, when Stephen gets dragged off and essentially lynched by a stoning mob, I think they didn't know from, one day to another. And I'm sure there are Christians abroad right now who are in similar situations. They don't know from one day to the next what's going to happen, who's going to disappear, who's going to be grabbed or whatever. So, and, Peter couldn't always count on an angel to come and let him out of prison. Peter is imprisoned, if I recall, twice. So once.
Whoa, Lydia, we got to throw the jingle out for you even saying that. That's for the.
Well, but supposedly, what Ehrman is critiquing is like, even if we did take Acts to be, true, okay, well, in Acts, Peter is in prison 2 different times, and he probably wondered, what God was going to let happen to him next time. So it's just a very, very uncertain situation. And as Jonathan is saying, they're risking life and liberty. That is easily supportable from the information in the Book of Acts.
Let's also not forget how all this kicks off. Jesus gets crucified.
Right.
At the instigation of the Jewish leadership with the cooperation of the Roman procurator. All right, this is not an auspicious beginning. I like the way that William Paley puts it in a statement that he prefixes to every chapter in part 1 of his view of the evidences of Christianity. There's satisfactory evidence that many, professing to be original witnesses of the Christian miracles, passed their lives in labors, dangers, and sufferings, voluntarily undergone an attestation of the accounts which they delivered, and solely in consequence of their belief of those accounts. I think that's a nice, tight summary of what we're saying. They passed their lives in labors and dangers and sufferings. Not all of them died for it, but they all were in a volatile situation in which this was what they could see coming and what, in fact, many of them were subjected to. And you don't need a top-down order of persecution from the emperor in order for there to be a lot of local persecution taking place.
Right. And I think one of the things that Paulogia does is he'll say, well, we only hear about Peter and like a handful of the apostles, and the rest of them just kind of all fall off the scene from there, which seems to me like if it's not something explicitly laid out for him, then it's able to cast some doubt on it. And it's like, but it seems to me like the inference is already like extremely strong based on the circumstances and the conditions. And it's just like, why assume that they just disappeared and did nothing with the church and all this other stuff? It's just kind of a silly argument to just say, well, what did they do? Get out of Dodge? I mean, I don't know.
Well, yeah, and actually Acts contradicts the idea that they got out of Dodge. I forget which chapter it is, but in the persecution from Saul of Tarsus, it said he was persecuting, and many of the Christians were scattered abroad from Jerusalem. Then I think it says, except for the apostles. And so the apostles are being spoken of as a group. It gives a list of their names right in Acts 1. There seems to be a lot of concern to have these specific people and have them named, and then they're called the apostles, and they hang together for quite a number of chapters into the book of Acts, even while persecution is going on. So it's not even just saying, well, we don't, we should assume, inferentially that they were still working for the church, but we can even go further than that, because Acts is repeatedly referring to the apostles did this and the apostles did that, and it's listed them right at the beginning.
Cool. All right. Well, let's continue.
Content of their claims, which we find in the gospel accounts themselves, shows that it's very unlikely that they were mistaken, because that's the kind of thing that you're very unlikely to be mistaken about, with all these different groups seeing him and interacting with him in all these different ways at different times.
Yeah, I don't think any of that happened.
Therefore, the best explanation of what they claimed is that they were telling the truth and Jesus was really risen from the dead.
The best explanation for parts of the Bible being true is that all of the Bible is true.
Okay, Lydia, I know you. I think you messaged me about this one. So, is that really what you're saying? Come on, Lydia. How could you be such a naive, dumb baby to say such a thing?
I mean, once again, look at this. The Bible. It's like the Bible is this one thing. But even if we just held it to the Gospels, so let's start with the fact I'm not an inerrantist. Maybe Paulogia doesn't know that, but I don't even think that all of it is true. But second of all, when I use those arguments, for the reliability, then that's supposed to support the idea that the resurrection accounts are what the witnesses claimed. That isn't even necessarily that they're true. Now, eventually, then I say, since it looks like these other explanations don't explain the data, it looks like Jesus really did rise from the dead. Not just for the Bible tells me so, but by an inference to the best explanation concerning what it appears that the original witnesses claimed. So how you get out of that, if some of what's in the Bible is true, then everything that's in the Bible is true, I really don't know. That's an amazing straw man right there.
I think there's a grave failure here to engage with the very notion of inference to the best explanation. The closest he gets is that he uses the phrase best explanation, but he's not engaging with the structure of the argument at all. One gets the impression he doesn't even understand what that would mean. At least he certainly hasn't given us any ammunition for refuting that accusation of himself.
Yeah, and as I recall, Lydia actually addressed this very question in the video that he's supposed to be responding to. I think, if I recall, Cameron had asked Lydia about the charge of circular reasoning. Is it that we're claiming that is the best explanation for the resurrection that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, of course, that would be a circular argument, but that's not what we're saying. We're saying rather that the best explanation for the nature and variety of the claims that emerged from those that were purportedly eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection that we find in the Gospels is the resurrection hypothesis. And we make an argument that the Gospels and Acts accurately reflect what was being asserted, what was being proclaimed by those who were purportedly eyewitnesses, and then we have to determine whether they were honestly mistaken, lying, or they were in fact correct.
Well, he's going to play that. As we keep going, he's actually going to get to that. And by the way, I told Cameron to ask me that question. That was a suggested question that I had him ask me. And so it's strange that even though I addressed it, somehow it's still not really getting through.
Yeah. All right, let's continue.
Gotcha.
So how would you respond to this objection that it's sort of question begging to assume that the Gospels are reliable?
Well, obviously, to say that the resurrection accounts are true is building in the idea that Jesus rose from the dead. That would be question begging. But saying the gospel resurrection accounts record what the people in a position to know claimed, while it is not widely granted by scholars,
nor skeptical YouTubers,
that the fact that something isn't widely granted isn't the same thing as question begging. And we're prepared to argue even for that proposition that this is what they claimed.
Of course, reliability of the Gospels would be tough to fit into your 1-minute pitch.
Good Friday, I think it was this year, I was invited by Areopagus Forum to give a presentation. And so I made that my 30-minute level version of the maximalist case that shows how I would bring in more information, how I would bring in more detail, and so forth.
Perhaps, if there's interest, I will one day go through that entire 30-minute presentation, but I have a feeling it would completely break my jingle.
What did they claim? Well, they said that different groups of them had lengthy conversations with Jesus. They said that on different occasions, people were able to touch Jesus. The women claimed that several of them were together, saw Jesus, and grasped his feet. Well, they said that Jesus ate with them on more than one occasion.
I feel like I'm fairly representing her case when I say that she wants me to make a leap that because some names and places and customs correspond with historical names, places, and customs, that all of the events described necessarily happened as well.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
And the Spider-Man. Oh, it's the Spider-Man fallacy, everybody.
He thinks he is fairly representing your argument.
Well, what's funny about that is that the actual quotes he gave are from the first part of my Areopagus presentation. And then at minute 17, I said, okay, so what would be the best, skeptical reply to this? And I said, well, the best skeptical reply would be to attempt to say they didn't really claim that. And then I went on to give, I would call it like a little sampler, of the kinds of evidences I would bring for reliability. Now, he was probably going to use the Spider-Man and I don't think this undesigned coincidence thing sounds like much of anything like he's going to do in the rest of the video to those. But it's a little strange that the actual quotes he gives from me are from the first part where I'm laying out basically what I've already said to Cameron here, rather than from the second part of the Areopagus thing where I am at least trying to give an evidence sampler of the kinds of evidence I would give for the reliability of the Gospels. That's just really weird. And then he pivots immediately to the Spider-Man thing. So go ahead.
Yeah, Jonathan, do you have some thoughts on the Spider-Man fallacy? Because you wrote that article where even Bart Ehrman kind of fell into that when he was trying to criticize Colin Hemmer's arguments in the book of Acts. And so, would you mind touching on that for just a moment?
Sure. If you want my detailed answer on the Spider-Man fallacy, I refer viewers to that essay on my website responding to Bart Ehrman on the book of Acts, one of his blog posts that he wrote. But in brief, when we look at the Gospels and Acts, what we find is, to borrow a phrase from Tim McGrew, that the authors get hard or difficult things right. And it's not major, big picture things like who was the emperor at the time or something like that, but rather, very minor details, which are often, confirmed in very incidental ways by extra biblical sources as well. We have to be careful about anachronistically thinking that the ancients could just look things up on Google or Wikipedia or pop down to the local library to find that sort of information, that very detailed and specific information that they portray in the Gospels and Acts. So I don't find the Spider-Man fallacy to really be a serious objection to the case that we're trying to make. Tim, do you have anything to add?
Just that one of the things that is probably too much to hope for from a YouTuber who is capable of doing the kinds of misrepresentations that Paul has given so far is an actual engagement with the actual arguments someone has put forward. Even the arguments that someone has put forward in a sampler, in a video, This is just, life is short, argument is hard, and jingles are quick and snappy, and your viewers love them. So I have not a lot of hope that this is someone who is going to be up to the hard work of actually thinking about an argument and not misrepresenting it. He's batting 0 so far. So that's not good.
I wanted to mention something that Eric showed. I'm not on Twitter, so I learned about this from Eric that
got it pulled up here. Yeah.
Pardon?
I got it pulled up here. Is it the shawarma one?
The shawarma one, yeah. So that evidently Paulogia on Twitter mentioned a shawarma restaurant in, I guess it's New York City, and it fits together with something in a Marvel movie where Tony Stark mentions a shawarma restaurant, and so like as if the Marvel movie gets this right, and like I don't know whether it's supposed to be the same shawarma restaurant or whatever. Maybe it is, but it's this strange schizophrenic view that skeptics often have, and I think Luke is a really good place to see that schizophrenia. So take the census in Luke, where they're saying, oh man, he just got that completely wrong. There wasn't a census at the time of Jesus' birth, certainly not under Quirinius. Quirinius wasn't the governor, and what a bumbler, right? But then when you come to the exact placement of this island, the exact dialect that they were speaking, the political structure in some obscure town in the Roman Empire or whatever, stuff that sometimes we only know from inscriptions. We don't even always know it from whole documents. We might just find an inscription on a stone somewhere or whatever that confirms it. Suddenly, Luke is capable of a hoax of incredible subtlety, where he's traveling around and he's like, oh man, I'm going to note that dialect that they spoke here, and oh, that's pretty interesting, that's what their rulers are called, and I'll put that in my novel, basically, and then he's going to weave these into the book of Acts and deceptively portray it as a historical record of the travels of St. Paul, which he accompanied Paul on. Gigantic, super well done, super subtle hoax. Well, which is it? Is he a bumbler? Pick one. Is he a bumbler that can't get the census right, or is he just a world-class hoaxer who's using all kinds of little details he's picking up on his own journeys to make a phony set of stories about the Apostle Paul? I don't think that they ever think about that they're really trying to have it both ways.
Let me just say a word about the structure of the reasoning here, because this is not actually rocket science, but it seems completely to have bypassed Paul here. When an author gets many details right, details that he couldn't have known whether later readers would have the resources to confirm, then we have to account for the fact that he got them right. And we can account for that fact in several different ways, but not all of the attempts to account for it do an equally good job. We can take skeptical hypotheses for a test drive. We can take the hypothesis that he jumped in his TARDIS and came forward in time and checked Wikipedia for a test drive. We can take the hypothesis that Luke actually accompanied Paul for a lot of the journeys on a test drive. And the only one of these that comes out really as even remotely convincing, and I've argued this extensively with regard to Bart Ehrman's criticisms, is that Luke was close up to the facts and, in fact, accompanied Paul for some of the journeys commencing in Acts 16. There's really no other good way to account for this. You can always make up something. This is how conspiracy theories run. You can always make up an explanation, right? You can make up stories about alien abductions. L. Ron Hubbard is into the whole alien thing. Why Tom Cruise believes in all that, I'm not sure. But made up theories that in some half-assed way make it logically possible for you to deny some particular point that you wish to deny do not become good explanations simply because they allow you to escape. That doesn't make a good explanation. It's actually got to give a good account of the data. And so we'll more on that in a moment, as we're about to see some good examples of failure to do that.
It's just weird to me that if getting facts right doesn't count, but getting facts wrong, whoa, he's unreliable. It's kind of a heads I win, tails you lose kind of thing. So.
Yes.
Well, and Bart Ehrman has explicitly said that, and I believe Jonathan discusses that in that blog post, that Ehrman made a literal probabilistic error. He said it doesn't count at all for them to get these things right, but it counts big time if they get something wrong. I mean, that's like literally impossible. You can't have asymmetries. If anything, I think the asymmetry goes the other way, that it counts more to get something hard right than to get something hard wrong. But you can't have a complete asymmetry to where something, basically E is evidence for H, but not E is no evidence whatsoever against H. That's like literally probabilistically impossible.
Okay.
Lydia ignores that the most convincing lies have a kernel of truth.
Lies have a kernel of truth in them.
Every lie you tell holds a shred of truth.
The lie and the truth had to feel the same.
And of course, her household are the most vocal advocates of something called undesigned consequences in the Bible.
One kind that I've written a whole book on.
He fixed it. He fixed it.
He put a little the different accounts of the Gospels and the casual things that they casually mention. That casualness is very important.
A full refutation is beyond the scope of this video today. Even when I was a devout, inerrant Bible-affirming Christian, I found this line of thinking to be stretching the facts beyond credulity. Allow me to recommend a recent debate on this topic between Dr. Bart Ehrman and Lydia's husband, Tim McGrew.
In terms of the undesigned coincidences, I think what we're overlooking is that there is a very wide and broad stream of early Christian tradition as people are telling stories about Jesus and his disciples before anything's written down. These Gospels are being written down years later. Even if you date them early, they're years later. Christians are telling stories about Jesus and his disciples year after year after year, and a lot of people hear stories, and many of the stories are similar stories. And so, of course, when later Gospel writers
right there. Hold it.
write down things, they've got.
Hold on. There we go. All right.
Yeah. Okay. The undesigned coincidences are not about the parts that are similar. It's specifically not passages where Matthew tells about a healing in Capernaum and so does Mark in mostly the same words. That's not what the undesigned coincidences are at all. In fact, he's missing, and Bart is just blithely blowing past because he's never heard of it before.
Right, Bart didn't study for that debate.
Right. Now, Bart clearly got caught completely without even having looked at undesigned coincidences, and so he naturally misrepresents the argument. Again, he's a master at this. But what Lydia said when she was set this up, she said this word casual, right? These things are casual connections. That's actually the strength of the case. It's not two authors saying more or less the same thing in a similar set of words. That's exactly not what we're talking about. And so this is all beside the point. And of course, Bart loves to argue by the Jericho method. Instead of actually conducting an assault, he walks round and round some topic, uttering some platitudes in the hopes that it'll just fall down eventually.
So one of the points that is quite common is as a rejoinder to undesigned coincidences, and I think this is what Ehrman is getting at to some extent here as well, is the idea that the Gospels are based on some sort of source, perhaps oral tradition or written sources, and that the Gospel accounts are copying from this common source, and so they just tend to emphasize different aspects, and so that results in these illusions of undesigned coincidences, even when they're not in fact undesigned at all. And there's a number of problems, of course, with that. One, of course, is that for many undesigned coincidences, they actually exist between different pericopes, not even parallels of the same account. And also, of course, this argument of oral tradition can't even pertain to the book of Acts and letters of Paul, because, I mean, there are no oral traditions concerning Paul's life.
I don't know, Jonathan, if we can make up an source out of whole cloth, right, an entirely imaginary source, why can't we just make up imaginary sources for everything?
Right.
I think this is a wonderful technique. I can't wait to start applying this to all kinds of other areas. I'm just going to pretend that there is a totally imaginary document which is totally real. What properties does it have? What things does it say? Well, it says whatever the things are that I need to get around your argument. How's that? Wow, really? Really?
You know, I almost think you're giving Bart too much credit there, Jonathan. I don't think he even got as far as the source type thing. My recollection is he doesn't deal with a single concrete alleged undesigned coincidence in that debate. He hadn't read up on it. He took the debate off to discussing, authorship of the Gospels or something, wasted a bunch of time, and then he just kind of said this stuff, which is not even pertinent. I think he literally didn't even know any specific undesigned coincidences or try to deal with them. And so now Paulogia is waving his hand in the direction of Ehrman, waving his hand in the direction vaguely of people telling stories and something about people telling stories. And so, of course, they're going to agree with one another, which is not coping with any specific undesigned coincidences whatsoever. I mean, not at all. I mean, I think Bart was really lazy in preparation.
I agree. Another problem with the R source theory, of course, and Tim kind of alluded to this, is that the historicity hypothesis is a simpler hypothesis, because the R source theory involves an additional auxiliary hypothesis that we don't have independent evidence for. It inserts something between what we have in the Gospels and the real life situation that we don't have independent reason to think exists. So we should favor, I think, the simplest explanation. And then you've also got the extra biblical confirmations of the Gospels, which raise the prior probability of the historical hypothesis to begin with. And so that should, of course, also for that reason be the favored hypothesis. And then also for many of those accounts, you have reconcilable variations, including, the feeding of the 5,000, as you know, is the only miracle account that's found apart from the resurrection across all four Gospels. And it's also the account that has the most undesigned coincidences. There's also, as Lydia has written about in her books too, there are reconcilable variations between the four accounts of the feeding of the 5,000. And so it really doesn't look like there is a strong literary dependence between the accounts concerning this event, and that one can also make this argument for other cases where we can find undesigned coincidences between the Gospels.
Yeah. Let me just explain a little bit of what Jonathan means by an source here. Again, I think it's giving Bart too much credit to think he had that in mind, but some people have tried this. So people are familiar with, if they are familiar with undesigned coincidences, let's take an example. There's one about the grass being green, mentioned in Mark at that time, and it's Passover time, mentioned only in John, and each of these is mentioned only in one gospel, and then that fits together because the grass would be green around that time in Galilee. So an so-called an source, and that's a term that I think Tim and I coined, theory would be, well, there was one source, not mind you reality, that was out there that mentioned both that the grass was green and that it was Passover time. And then John just put down part of that, and Mark just put down part of that, and then it all fit together. But it all came from this sort of thing, which was some version of the story that someone was telling, maybe out there, that had both of the details in it. And as what Jonathan means about simplicity is that basically what you've done is you've taken a hypothetical source and you've given it the properties of reality, and you've put it up there instead of reality, and then you've got space between that alleged made up hypothetical source and reality where they could have been, false. The source might or might not be telling the truth. Whereas if we just attribute those two characteristics, the greenness of the grass and the time of year, to reality, that's simpler than attributing them to this lost documentary source. And then, as he was also pointing out, we have alleged or apparent discrepancies between the different accounts of the feeding of the 5,000, which doesn't fit at all well with the idea of a lost source that by Jove just looked just like reality, and people just took different little parts of it. So that's what Jonathan's talking about there, and people have occasionally tried that. It's a very, very unsatisfactory reply to the argument.
Right. One additional thing. If you're going to say, there was such an early source and they copied each of them some things from it, but that original source didn't really tell us the truth about what happened, then it's a remarkable piece of fiction that had enough detail to provide the resources for all of these undesigned coincidences. We have examples of ancient fiction, right? We can read the Currier, for example. This is a modern, realistic, detailed novel with incredible amounts of research behind it, of a kind that didn't exist until Daniel Defoe wrote Robinson Crusoe. So someone, as C.S. Lewis once said, without any predecessors, without any known successors, just suddenly invented the entire modern technique of realistic narrative, or else this is a document written by somebody pretty close up to the facts, like Johnson and Boswell.
Right. What would you say to somebody who said, well, like, these undesigned coincidences could pop up? Because I can hear some people thinking, probably the gears turning. One of the things I've probably seen on social media is like, well, it just could have popped up through enough oral tradition. And it's just, I think that's an extremely strained way of explaining it. It doesn't work. But go ahead and explain it.
Say what they mean by that more.
Right.
Like, okay, tell me what you're envisaging, and how does you can't just use the phrase oral tradition like, abracadabra. How does that explain? Because to me, that really looks like just kind of a gesture. If it is supposed to be this source that we were just talking about, then we've answered that the oral tradition was this thing that had all these different properties,
right.
And we have absolutely no evidence for a single story version that included all these details and then got broken up later, and that we don't find anywhere.
Right.
Right.
So if that's what's meant by oral tradition, then the answer we've already given is pertinent. If that's not what's meant, I don't even see how it's supposed to be explanatory.
All right, we'll continue here. We're 52 minutes in, and we still got a lot left here. So
some similar sources. I mean, there are scholars, of course, who think that John has access to Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which would mean that it's not a coincidence at all, that he simply knows these other Gospels. But whether that's true or not, right. John is certainly...
Go ahead, Tim.
The undesigned coincidences crisscross the documents in all directions.
Right.
John explains things in the synoptics. The synoptics explain things in John. It's not just a one-directional kind of connection. And it's the scope and the variety of the undesigned coincidences that gives the argument its cumulative strength. This is a cumulative argument.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you could always argue of one thing. Well, maybe that was just an accident, or maybe both parts of that were in this totally imaginary oral tradition document that they had access to. But actually, once you have a whole bunch of these, what you're doing is basically calling the source or the very rich and very unified oral tradition. You're just calling it that and then attributing to it everything that you need in order to explain away every kind of evidence.
It's ad hoc.
Notice. Oh, go ahead.
I can do this. I can explain away the evidence of the moon landings by appeal to very clever aliens. And if you say to me, really, the aliens thought of that? I'll just nod and I'll say, yep, see how clever they are. This is every conspiracy theory ever. We imagine something wholly hypothetical, and then we give it exactly the properties that we need to avoid going wherever we don't want to go.
Notice that Bart says that if John had access to the earlier documents, he says something like, which means this isn't a coincidence at all. That doesn't mean that. Wait a minute. The fact that John, I think probably John did have access to the earlier documents, but that doesn't mean that everything that fits together in an undesigned coincidence is automatically explained away. It's the subtlety and casualness that makes it appear that John is not trying to fit. So we'll take the one I gave a moment ago when John says that it was Passover. It's, I think, pretty absurd to imply that John goes, hey, I remember Mark says the grass was green. I won't mention, I'll very cleverly not mention that the grass was green. I'll mention it was Passover, and maybe somebody will notice that fits together with the fact that the grass was green. Cool. Of course, maybe they won't notice it. Okay, so like the very apparent casualness of it means that whether John had access to Mark or not, he doesn't appear to be trying to connect what he's saying to Mark in this hyper subtle way. But because Bart didn't prep, it's quite clear if you listen to that whole thing, he didn't prep at all. He doesn't even try to give any concrete examples. He just blithely says, well, if John had access to the earlier Gospels, or if the Gospels had access to each other, well, then that just takes care of it. Dusts his hands and moves on. That shows a complete failure to understand the actual nitty-gritty nature of the argument.
Right. All right.
I've heard many of the same stories told in slightly different forms that were available to the other gospel writers. And so it doesn't have to be some kind of weird, uncanny coincidence that they mention somebody and give some detail that coincides with what someone else says. These are stories that are in circulation.
Or this article by Dr. Richard Currier.
The argument from Undesigned Coincidences is basically tinfoil hat. It lacks any scholarly basis, is completely devoid of methodology, and is mostly delusional. Many of the claimed coincidences don't even exist. Some are obviously just coincidences, some may even be copying errors. And most are even more obviously just authors embellishing or rewriting stories to suit their liking, using no other source than the previous gospel we know they were copying from.
Or if you prefer the conclusions of a Christian.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Detailed rebuttal to Richard Currier. I do have a very lengthy and painfully detailed response to Richard Currier. It's in 6 parts, which you can find on my website, jonathanmclatchie.com. So if anyone wants the detailed refutation and takedown of Currier's analysis there, then that's the place to go.
A number of years ago, I said to Jonathan, it's not very glamorous, but somebody's got to take out the trash. Jonathan's 6-part response to Currier is the exhibit A of someone who could be doing much better things with his time, stopping to take out the trash. Thank you, Jonathan.
And a small point of order here. I'm not saying this really matters, but since Paul chose to mention it in the part that maybe people didn't hear, he says, if you prefer the views of a Christian, and he's about to cite a blog post.
I don't think the guys,
read that blog post, and maybe he's a Christian, but I didn't. I don't think he is.
I actually interacted with him recently on Twitter because somebody shared it, and the actual author of the article chimed in. And I think he actually is. He's and Jonathan's actually written a response to him as well. It's John Nelson, I think is his name.
I know him well. I've actually met him
Thomas Horatio is John Nelson?
Yeah, it's just a pen name.
Oh, that explains a lot. Oh, you know what? I think I might have read this same blog post published
a couple years ago.
The name John Nelson. I think he may have published it under both names. No wonder it looked familiar. Okay, yeah, got it.
Okay, we'll get to it.
This article by Thomas Horatio.
My aim has rather been to show that undesigned coincidences are no fast track to establishing the historicity of the Gospels. One of the reasons why Williams, and to a greater extent, McGrew's presentation of undesigned coincidences will seem so compelling is because they are interested in the text as an apologetic. They are not, in this apologetic work, factoring in the much more difficult work which historians of the text and exegetes do in theirs. This is no attempt to denigrate apologetics, nor these scholars. It is simply to say that a short work, of the variety they have produced, cannot do justice the alternative explanations which may cause the appearance of some undesigned coincidence to disappear.
Or we can get out from...
Okay, so one of the things that Nelson talks about, maybe Lydia, you remember, Jonathan, I think you remember, he talks about like the redaction criticism and, perhaps Mark put in the green grass because, it's an allusion to the 23rd Psalm and, a lot of this stuff.
It doesn't explain anything.
Right.
It doesn't explain the undesigned coincidence at all.
Yeah. And so I actually had some friends of mine, some skeptical friends of mine who seemed very, very impressed with this article. And I'm just kind of like, wow, you guys like this? Like, there's so many problems, but Jonathan, Tim, whatever, go ahead, jump in. Tell me, because I think, Jonathan, I sent you just kind of a memory jogger there. So, yeah. What about John Nelson's?
Let's go all kinds of places with this. Point number one is what Lydia just brought up. The undesigned coincidence there is, one of the undesigned coincidences is between the green grass and the date of the event. How does a reference to the 23rd Psalm connect this to Passover? It doesn't. It leaves it a complete accident, which is not a good explanation. This is exactly what I was saying. You can't just say, I thought of some other way that I can account for this, and thereby have given as good an explanation as the one that we're pursuing here with the reportage model. So that's one thing. For another, let's take the Matthew 14, Luke 8 undesigned coincidence. Tell me how redaction criticism is supposed to have helped there, and do it in some way other than saying, well, the dog ate my source, but I'm sure it said.
Yeah, and that comes up with the Joseph one. So I just read that article. I didn't realize I was rereading it. It's just a different handle for the author, but he tries to do the source thing with an oral tradition that Joseph was not around anymore, presumably dead by the time of Jesus' ministry. And he's like, well, there was just an oral tradition to that effect. And it's like, well, if it was a true oral tradition, then why don't we just talk about truth instead of talking about the tradition? My point was that the Gospels all agree in this kind of interesting way where Joseph just drops off the planet early on. It'll refer to his family, and it's always Mary and never Joseph, indicating that they are accurately reporting the way that these various interactions with Jesus' family go in the absence of Joseph. It is classic source reasoning for Nelson to go, well, this was just an oral tradition instead, like, where's that coming from? Why not just say it was true? And they knew it because it was true, and they knew about Jesus' ministry.
And to the extent that we do find this in the Church Fathers, why shouldn't we take the absolutely natural explanation that they got this by reading the Gospels?
Right.
All right. Let's continue here.
Information from renowned Christian philosopher Dr. William Lane Craig on the McGrew's enterprise in general.
As I mentioned before, Dr. Bill Craig calls the Palean approach, which is essentially the maximal data approach, forever obsolete. In Reasonable Faith, he calls it that.
It is naive and outdated simply to trot out the dilemma liar, lunatic, or Lord and adduce several proof texts where Jesus claims to be the Son of God, the Messiah, and so forth. The publicity generated by the Jesus Seminar and the Da Vinci Code has rendered that approach forever obsolete.
He calls the approach of...
Go ahead, Tim.
Okay, so number one, that isn't actually anything like a description of the Palean approach, and the quotation that Lydia is referring to is from a different passage here. Point number two, I think Bill's just wrong, both about the Palean approach and, frankly, about the epistemic relevance of a sociological phenomenon. The Da Vinci Code? Really? That's a reason for abandoning anything? No, it's a reason for speaking clearly, for bringing forward evidence. But Dan Brown's extremely fanciful and imaginative novel is not a reason that renders obsolete the kind of patient sifting of concrete historical evidence of the kind that is best characterized as the Palean approach. So that's just, I disagree with Bill there, but that's not even the passage where he's doing the disagreeing. Let's put that aside. The argument from undesigned coincidences isn't even what Bill has in mind when he's attacking the Palean approach, because two things. First of all, when you look into the details of it, he's going after something else. And second, he actually likes a lot of undesigned coincidences, which Paul apparently just doesn't even know.
And Will and Craig also endorsed Lydia's book. If you
it's on the very top of the back of the jacket here. So
right, I mean, I did bring that out, and I do really criticize Bill for saying that stuff, and I think it's highly unfortunate. So it's understandable that Paul's going to jump on that, but he's apparently unaware that there's sort of a dual approach that Bill Craig has. On the one hand, he likes undesigned coincidences a lot, but on the other hand, he doesn't like the maximal data approach, and he also kind of, he has also unfortunately endorsed the fictionalizing literary devices of Mike Licona. So Bill is kind of trying to have it both ways. He's got a lot of different vectors and a lot of different directions that he's going, that he's kind of trying to put together. I don't think it makes a unified approach to all of this. I've pressed that point with him. I think that's a problem, but I do think Paul is jumping too quickly on what I brought out about Bill and assuming that that means he rejects undesigned coincidences when in fact he doesn't. William Paley, which is basically what I'm doing, I would call it a Palean approach, forever obsolete. So he's definitely trying to distance himself from that. And I think as long as you do that, you're going to not be able to give a strong argument specifically for the physical resurrection of Jesus.
I agree with Craig that the liar, lunatic, or Lord trilemma is obsolete rhetoric from an information-poor era. The person who wins me back to biblical authority will be primarily tackling the legend option that C.S. Lewis left off the table.
Okay, I'm going to say something super quick. I'm going to have a video on this tomorrow for anybody who's watching, but C.S. Lewis was not an idiot who didn't understand the legend option. He wrote a whole essay called Fernseed and Elephants, or Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. It goes by a couple of different names. He talks about it in other essays as well. He studied these people, and he was not impressed really at all. And he does talk about how 1 minute a mainstream idea in his field, which is literary criticism, can turn into a not mainstream idea really fast as more information it comes out and people actually study these different things. And so to say something like consensus of scholars to somebody like C.S. Lewis, he's going to be like, okay, whatever. But he did absolutely consider the legend option. So that's my axe to grind there. If anybody's got anything else to add, go for it. If not, I will hit the play button again. And we'll.
I just love the line from that essay of Lewis where he says, "While I respect the learning of the great biblical critics, I am not yet persuaded that their judgment is equally to be respected." That's a mic drop.
Yeah. And so I encourage anybody who's interested in these topics, find the essay. You can just search it online. You can get it for free. It's posted in multiple places. I think it's on Norm Geisler's website. Anyway.
As for undesigned coincidences, at this moment, they go into the same category as the Shroud of Turin. I'll concede that I haven't done exhaustive research, but what I have read is incredibly unimpressive and utterly non-persuasive.
It sounds like he's read Richard Currier's essay and the blog post, and Tim, like you said, I don't think he's read the books. And so, Jonathan, we talk about this in terms of like with some of the people that we minister to through with Talk About Doubts, as far as keeping your cognitive bias in check, reading the best sides of both arguments and different things like that. What advice would you give to Paulogia real quick, as far as, I mean, because this just feels so slapped together, to be totally honest.
He knows a whole lot.
Yeah.
I mean, the very fact that he quoted that from Ehrman and seems to be under the impression that Ehrman is considered it in detail, I think shows that Paul hasn't considered it in detail at all, or he'd recognize that Ehrman isn't considering it in detail, if I could put it that way. So anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely think that, this is one advice that I often give people, is that you should never go public with an argument until you know what the counter argument is to what you're about to say, because then you're going to look ignorant when someone comes forward and corrects you. And I think Paulogia has simply not done his homework. He's done a very, very shallow analysis of the subject of undesigned coincidences. He's not read the literature, and so he just doesn't know how we respond to the objections that he's putting forward. And so he comes across, to those of us who actually spend a lot of our lives studying this stuff, he comes across as someone that's quite ignorant of the topic. And so I think that I would definitely suggest that he actually go and study the subject before producing videos trying to say that he's refuted us.
I want to also mention, I believe the date on that thing by Nelson was 2020, and yet I think if it came out earlier under the name Nelson, it was several years before. So maybe the 2020 was an updated version. But by that time, The Mirror of the Mask was already out. And so one of the things that Nelson makes a big deal about is he says, why is she setting aside, everybody loves to hate this phrase in Hidden in Plain View, setting aside the apparatus of critical scholarship? Because I said that. I said, I'm setting aside the apparatus of critical scholarship. And they're like, well, why did she do that? Because I'm trying to show, which is something that critical scholars do on their side all the time. I'm trying to show that this theory, that the reportage model, has an enormous amount of explanatory power for these undesigned coincidences. And I'm showing that in a relatively brief book at a popular level. I'm taking it out for a drive and I'm saying, let's consider it seriously and let's see how well it explains these coincidences. I think that's a completely legitimate project. And if it makes the book much longer if you're stopping and saying, well, let's look at all of the alternatives. It's funny how redaction critics never seem to worry that they're not giving a fair hearing to the reportage model when they take their redaction critical views out and say, oh, look how this explains, what we find. So I'm doing that kind of explanatory power analysis, or what we would call likelihood analysis, on the reportage model side and Hidden in Plain View. But in TMOM and in The Eye of the Beholder, I am actually considering those critical alternatives much more. That's why they're much fatter books. So I don't think that Nelson would be able to complain in that way about TMOM, for example, which was just out at the time of the most recent date on that essay. And it's like I do consider those redactional and non-reportage alternatives, and I find them gravely wanting in explanatory force. So if someone reads Hidden in Plain View and they just roll their eyes and they say, why was she setting aside the critical scholarly apparatus? Well, that's why. And read my fatter books, then don't complain and tell me they're too fat.
Yeah.
If you want to see me dealing more with those alternatives.
Yeah, and I think Nelson even says, like, either she's unaware of it or just chooses not to deal with it at all. And I'm just like,
I made it clear I was choosing not to deal with it at all, and I gave you my best why,
Exactly. So we still doing good? We only got like a couple minutes left, I think.
Yeah, let's finish it up.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
I'm reticent to spend months diving into an argument that has failed to convince any significant number of Christian scholars, let alone skeptics of any stripe. And Lydia, in particular.
Go ahead, Tim.
Okay. The argument from undesigned coincidences convinced generations of Christian scholars. The fact that as a sociological accident, it fell out of popular knowledge to the extent that F.F. Bruce who was a very complete scholar by any reasonable ordinary standard, had to rediscover it by accident and wrote an ecstatic essay on it once he rediscovered it, is just that. It's an illustration that sociology is cruel, and sometimes we lose sight of things that are fascinating. But this was an argument. It is still, when used between the Book of Acts and the Epistles of Paul, one of the primary sets of reasons for taking so seriously the Pauline authorship of, say, the 7 most widely attested Pauline epistles. This is an absurd.
I hate the nose counting approach, but if you're interested in nose counting, and if he's going to bring that up and throw that in my face that, oh, this hasn't convinced any large number of okay, then do go to Hidden in Plain View and open it up and look at page after page after page of endorsements. I mean, are they right? Well, you have to read the book and decide that for yourself. I'm certainly not using that as a marker of whether I'm right or not. But if Paul is going to say this hasn't convinced a large number of Christian scholars, actually it has. My later work, The Mirror of the Mask, was considered more controversial because I broke certain social taboos about criticizing other Christians. But as long as my Hidden in Plain View could be viewed as just a positive thing, and and we're just endorsing her work and she hasn't pissed us off yet, then I got lots of endorsements from Christian scholars. Make of that what you will, and you may decide they're all wrong and it's a crappy argument, but he's actually not quite correct here, just as a matter of social fact.
Well, and it's not as if you don't spend time talking about some of the bad habits of biblical scholarship, both from a Christian side and a non-Christian side.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, as I discovered even more after I wrote Hidden in Plain View, it is a very unfortunate fact that there are Christians, and I believe they are genuine Christians, who, like Nelson, I mean, just since we are talking about him here, have imbibed some of the bad habits of the guild. So yes, there are major problems with the guild, and being a Christian doesn't necessarily make you immune to them, it's sad to say.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're getting to a good part here. I definitely want to cover.
Credulous
so here we go.
And straining so hard to make unsubstantiated notions fit that she actually proposes that the book of Matthew was originally written in Hebrew in order to prop up a ridiculed notion of disrespected church father Papias.
But I think our Matthew, Greek Matthew, was a second version written by Matthew, but later. So kind of Hebrew Matthew, then Mark, then Greek Matthew, and probably after that, or approximately at the same time as Greek Matthew, Luke. I don't think Luke had access to Greek Matthew. That I think is clear. He may have had access to Hebrew Matthew.
That's about as tinfoil hat as I've ever seen from an apologist.
Okay, this part frustrated me so much because,
oh my gosh.
Lydia, I know you have some thoughts, but let me talk about.
You go.
Let me talk about something that Okay, do you know who else held to this theory? Maurice Casey, who is an atheist, okay, and a relatively modern scholar. I think he passed away not that long ago, like within the last 10 years or so. He talks about this Jesus evidence and argument, or mythicist myths, where he's attacking mythicism. He argues that Matthew did compose a sayings collection in Aramaic, a proto-Matthew, that was the source for both the Greek canonical Matthew and Luke. Casey suggests that this is what Papias meant. Oh, the discredited, stupid doofus Papias, when he said that each person translated and interpreted as he was able, and that later church fathers confused Proto-Matthew with the Greek Gospel of Matthew. That's Casey's theory. Are you going to really argue that Maurice Casey is a tinfoil hat motivated apologist? I mean, that's just the part. If you're gonna criticize somebody and try and discredit somebody and make them look desperate and just credulous and stupid, which are basically the words they use. He's so credulous and used to, like, this apologetic thing. Well, then, like, find out what the theory actually is and who else held it.
I bet Maurice Casey was just a raving fundamentalist. Right?
Yeah,
or Theodore Zahn. I think originally Theodore Zahn was a I don't know if he was an atheist. He might have been a deist or something, but he was a German scholar who definitely didn't believe in the resurrection of Jesus. It's known as the Zahn hypothesis. And the theory, what I just gave, and he just quoted me as giving, it was just a chronology of them. It's not particularly in and of itself apologetically helpful. Someone asked me what I thought of the synoptic problem. I told them what I thought of the synoptic problem. This has nothing to do with trying to prop up my apologetic positions or anything like that. It's just what I lean toward in terms of, and it's compatible with a very conservative view of Matthew, or even quite a liberal view of Matthew, as in the case of Casey. So it's pretty clear that Paul's never heard of it before, and figured that the fact that I said it must mean that I maybe made it up or something, because I'm a crazy tinfoil hat wearing apologist and he just doesn't know the literature.
Yeah. So that part just, I don't know, it just kind of got to me a little bit. So
it takes you about 2 seconds to Google Hebrew Gospel Hypothesis on Wikipedia and find references to Lessing, for crying out loud, Eichhorn. Yeah, right. Zahn, Belzer. This is not some kind of unknown theory. And if he knew enough to be thinking that he would prefer a Q hypothesis, then he surely should be aware that there are all kinds of people, not only people like N.T. Wright, but also people like Mark Goodacre, who are very critical of the Q hypothesis, the whole world without Q movement. And so I would say that here again, he's flailing, he's grasping at something that he can say because he really doesn't know what's going on. But when you produce regular content for your cartoon channel, you've got to keep on making it look like you know everything, and he doesn't.
Well, and not to mention the fact that I actually, when I spell this out at more length in my video on what I think is the synoptic problem, I'm actually treating Hebrew Matthew as more or less being in the place of Q. So in a sense, I'm not even completely rejecting something like Q. Even in that clip he just played where I said I don't think that Luke had access to Greek Matthew, that's a tell, as they say, that I'm going to explain the common material between Greek Matthew and Luke in some more Q-like fashion. So again, this is like one of the ways in which I'm almost more mainstream than some other things, even though it's not a majority opinion. It is one of the known theories that's out there.
Right. All right, I think he's almost done here. We just got like a second.
You and Undesigned Coincidences have won the support of your own camp, and then maybe I'll dig in.
Yep, that was it. So maybe he'll dig in after.
Maybe we should call him now. I've won the support of my own camp.
Yeah.
Call him up.
Maybe we should let him know. So, yeah, to me, when I first watched this, I clicked on it instantly. I was really excited to hear him feature you, and Paul and I have a lot of agreement regarding minimal facts or whatever. And then to just see him just so butcher this. To wrap up, what advice would you guys give Paulogia if he tries to go for a second round here at actually
try reading the things you're going to criticize before you criticize them? It does wonders for you. I have heavily annotated copies of Bart Ehrman's books. I went through them carefully before we got on the radio to have that rather amusing 2-hour-long debate. And the least he could do would be actually to try to read what he's going to criticize before he criticizes it. It's out there. It's not like it's hiding. He can even get a lot of it in public content online if he doesn't want to buy a book, if he's allergic to that. Though I do recommend that people look. And if they're wondering about the backdrop for things that Lydia bracketed in writing, hidden in plain view, then that's exactly where she goes. And some of the things we bracketed in our Blackwell article are things that Lydia tackles in the 2 subsequent books. So that's where that discussion is. Don't complain that this isn't the discussion when it's actually somewhere else. And you know where it is, and we've said where it is.
I think I would strongly advise getting rid of that "For the Bible Tells Me So" jingle. Like, just when you feel your hand reaching to play that, just pull your hand back and say, does that really apply? I think it would help Paul a lot to lose that whole idea of this is all the Bible. Instead, try thinking of them as at least potentially historical sources, at least presenting themselves as historical sources, and then come to think about what might be internal evidence for them or external evidence for them. What kind of evidence would you admit could count? as evidence that they are actually good historical sources. And don't just automatically reach for that jingle when you see somebody saying, well, this document in the says this, and it happens to be a book that's in the Bible. Don't assume that that means that this person is an idiot or is just asking you to take the Bible on faith. But ask yourself if you're actually open minded to the idea that these actually might be historical sources with value.
Exactly. And I think even in our conversation with Paulogia, I even had a slide that quoted you when you compare the minimal facts with maximal data. And this is what I quoted to him on there, and maybe he doesn't remember or whatever, but it says the happenstance of scholarly politics doesn't constrain the force of objective evidence. That something is not granted by skeptical and liberal scholars doesn't mean that it's weakly supported by non-question begging evidence, nor does it mean that it's based on a theological presupposition like the supposition of inerrancy. So we had this discussion, so just let's do better than this. So, well, guys, if you don't have any other last words, I think we could wrap it up. Thank you, Lydia, for taking some extra time with us. I really appreciate going over our time. So thank you so much for that. And thank you guys so much for watching. And Paulogia, I hope you take some of the things that we're saying to heart. We're not trying to come down on you like a ton of bricks necessarily, but like as theists and as atheists on these sides producing content, we need to do better. We need to actually listen to what both sides actually say, because otherwise you're going to make a straw man of somebody else's argument, and that doesn't help anybody. You're just misleading people when you do something like that. And if I do that, call me out. I want that kind of feedback. I want that kind of criticism. So thank you guys so much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you so much.
Good night.